The morning after Christmas in 1861, the Blackwood plantation outside Vicksburg woke to silence. No bell, no overseer's whistle, no smoke from the kitchen house. When neighbors arrived at noon, they found the main house standing perfectly intact. Doors open, breakfast plates still on the table. But every white person who had lived there was gone. 11 bodies would be discovered over the following week, buried in the cotton gin, hidden in the smokehouse rafters, weighted beneath the dock where the Blackwood family had shipped their fortunes for 30 years. The enslaved population had vanished entirely. 47 people, including 19 children, had disappeared into the Mississippi night. What investigators found in the cellar changed how the Confederacy understood the war it was fighting. Not a rebellion of armies, but a reckoning that had been building in kitchens, fields, and quarters for generations. 10 stories. 10 acts of violence so calculated, so complete, that they've been scrubbed from most histories. Until now. The system required violence to function. Not occasional, not exceptional, constant and structural. By 1860, 4 million enslaved people lived in 15 states, representing more capital than all American railroads, factories, and banks combined. The economics demanded control mechanisms that Southern legislatures, courts, and churches spent decades refining into doctrine. Overseers carried account books tracking not just labor output, but punishment ratios, lashes per spoiled bail, weeks in chains per escape attempt. Insurance companies in Charleston and New Orleans calculated actuarial tables for human property the way they did for cargo ships, pricing policies based on age, skill, and likelihood of resistance. The plantation bell system divided every day into segments, 4:30 in the morning until sunset, with 10 minutes for breakfast and 30 for dinner. Field hands worked in gangs, each supervised by a driver who answered to a white overseer who reported to the owner or his agent. House servants existed in a different hierarchy, closer to the family, more visible, but under constant surveillance. Children as young as 5 carried water or minded babies. By 8, they joined adult labor. By 12, girls faced the particular horror of being considered women by men who owned them. But violence wasn't just about productivity. It was pedagogical. Public whippings taught lessons to everyone watching. Sales that separated families demonstrated the permanence of ownership. Sexual exploitation established that no aspect of personhood remained protected. Slaveholders understood they were manufacturing consent through terror, and they wrote about it explicitly in their private correspondence and agricultural journals. The archive preserves these calculations in ledgers, letters, and legal records that scholars have been excavating for decades. Plantation account books list disciplinary, expenses, replacement whips, iron collars, leg irons, the services of professional slave breakers. Medical records document injuries treated and bodies that couldn't be saved. Wills specify which children should be sold to settle debts and which kept for breeding stock. Against this machinery, resistance took countless forms. Most were small, tools broken, fires started in fields, poison slipped into Sunday dinner that left the family sick, but not dead enough to trigger investigation. Songs encoded maps. Quilts signaled safe houses. The appearance of submission masked networks of information, mutual aid, and long-term planning. But some resistance was neither small nor coded. Some was apocalyptic. The German coast of Louisiana stretched along the Mississippi River northwest of New Orleans, a corridor of sugar plantations worked by thousands of enslaved people who had been purchased from the collapsing Saint-Domingue colony after its revolution. By January 1811, slaveholders in the territory were nervous. News of Haiti traveled through the enslaved population faster than through white society. Everyone knew what had happened when enslaved people decided they would rather die fighting than live in chains. On January 8, 1811, between 60 and 500 people, accounts vary wildly, rose on the plantation of Manuel Andry in St. John the Baptist Parish. They killed Andry's son and wounded Andry himself, who fled. Then they began moving downriver toward New Orleans, armed with cane knives, axes, a few stolen muskets, and tools repurposed as weapons. They ransacked plantations as they went, killing 2 more white men and recruiting others to their cause. Some accounts say they marched in formation with drums and flags. Others describe chaos and improvisation. What's documented is the scale of retribution. Territorial and federal troops, along with white militias, crushed the rebellion within 2 days. At least 95 people were executed, most after summary trials that lasted minutes. Their heads were placed on pikes along the river road from New Orleans to Andry's plantation, a 60-mile corridor of warnings that rotted for months in the subtropical heat. The German coast uprising terrified slaveholders because it proved that collective action was possible, that enough people acting together could temporarily invert the power structure, and that the veneer of control was thinner than they wanted to believe. It also demonstrated the brutal arithmetic of suppression. For every white person killed, 20 or more black people died in calculated retaliation designed to restore order through overwhelming force. But the heads on pikes sent another message, one that traveled through the enslaved community in whispers and songs. Resistance had happened. People had fought. The machinery had, for 48 hours, stopped functioning. In 1857, a fire at the Rousseau plantation outside Baton Rouge exposed a cavity in the kitchen house wall. Inside was a journal kept by an enslaved woman named Marguerite over 12 years. The ledger documented not labor or expenses, but crimes. 53 entries, each noting a date, a name, and a method. Most were forms of poisoning: rat poison in soup, Jimson weed in tea, crushed glass mixed into cornbread. Others involved accidents that weren't accidents: loose railings, frayed ropes, fires that spread faster than they should have. The journal was written in French, which Marguerite had learned from her mother, who had come from Saint-Domingue. The handwriting was careful, the entries clinical. No editorializing, no justification, just documentation. March 4th, 1849. White gravy, Monsieur Thibault. 3 days fever, recovered. Or, November 12th, 1851. Stairs, Madame Celeste. Broke her neck. Authorities arrested Marguerite, who was 63 years old and had worked on the Rousseau property for 41 years. During her trial, which lasted one afternoon, she neither confirmed nor denied the journal's contents. The defense argued it was fiction, a kind of fantasy revenge that gave her solace but had never been enacted. The prosecution brought medical testimony about symptoms consistent with the described methods. Neighbors testified that yes, those people had died on those dates, and yes, the circumstances had seemed unfortunate, but not suspicious at the time. Marguerite was hanged on August 19th, 1857. Her body was released to the Rousseau family, who buried her in the plantation cemetery with a marker that read only, "Marguerite, died 1857. What the journal revealed was that resistance could be patient, methodical, and invisible. Every death had appeared natural or accidental. No pattern had emerged until the documentation itself surfaced. Marguerite had been engineering mortality for over a decade while maintaining the appearance of loyal service. She had been, in effect, conducting a one-woman insurgency that killed more people than many rebellions. The terror this induced in slaveholding families was profound. If Marguerite could do this, any trusted servant could be doing the same. Every meal became suspect. Every accident required investigation. The foundation of domestic power, the assumption that those who served your food, tended your children, and knew your routines could be controlled through dependency and fear, suddenly looked fragile. The ledger passed through several hands before disappearing, but copies of key entries were transcribed in legal documents and newspaper accounts, which is how we know its contents today. It became an object of dark fascination, proof that the enslaved population was not passive, not grateful, not content. They were watching, they were waiting, and some of them were keeping careful records. Nat Turner saw visions, or so he claimed, and there's no reason to disbelieve him. Born into slavery in 1800 in Southampton County, Virginia, he was described even as a child as unusual, introspective, literate, given to fasting and prayer. By his late 20s, he had become a preacher among the enslaved community, interpreting dreams and signs with an authority that drew followers. In February 1831, Turner saw a solar eclipse and interpreted it as a signal. He began planning with a small group of men he trusted completely. The plan was not to escape, not to petition, not to negotiate. The plan was to kill every white person they encountered and march toward the county seat, gathering recruits until they had an army capable of seizing territory and holding it. On August 21st, 1831, Turner and 6 others began moving through the countryside. They killed Joseph Travis and his family first. Travis had been Turner's legal owner, though Turner was in practice hired out to other farms. Then they moved from house to house, farm to farm, killing 57 white people over 48 hours. The group swelled to between 50 and 70 participants. They spared almost no one they encountered, making no distinction between adults and children, between those who had directly enslaved them and those who simply lived in the same system. The militia and armed white civilians eventually crushed the rebellion. Turner evaded capture for 2 months, hiding in the woods, before being discovered on October 30th. His trial lasted 1 day. He was hanged on November 11th, 1831, and his body was flayed, skin distributed as souvenirs, flesh rendered for grease, bones kept as curiosities. But Turner's confession, dictated to his lawyer Thomas Ruffin Gray and published as a pamphlet, circulated widely. In it, Turner described his visions, his interpretations of signs, his belief that he was an instrument of divine judgment. The confession made clear that this was not a spontaneous act of rage, but a deliberate campaign executed with spiritual conviction. The aftermath extended far beyond the immediate participants. Virginia executed 56 people following the rebellion, 30 after formal trials, 26 summarily murdered by mobs. Estimates suggest that white militias and vigilantes killed between 100 and 200 black people in retaliation, many with no connection to the rebellion. More lasting was the legislative response. Virginia and other southern states passed laws prohibiting enslaved people from gathering for religious services without white supervision, from learning to read, from traveling without written permission. The laws codified the terror that Turner's rebellion had induced, transforming vague customs into legal structures designed to prevent anything similar from happening again. But the memory of Turner's rebellion traveled through both white and black communities, taking on mythic dimensions. For slaveholders, it was proof that even the most trusted, most integrated, most apparently docile enslaved people might be planning apocalypse. For the enslaved, it was proof that someone had tried, had succeeded for 2 days in making the masters afraid, had shown that the system could fracture. Turner's last recorded words, spoken at trial when asked if he regretted his actions, were, "Was not Christ crucified?" In 1839, a man named Edmund Driscoll took possession of his father's estate in Kentucky. 800 acres, 43 enslaved people, debts totaling $9,000. The property was failing. Tobacco prices had collapsed. The soil was exhausted. Driscoll, who was 26 and educated at Transylvania University, decided to shift the plantation's economic model entirely. He would breed enslaved people for sale. The mathematics were straightforward. An enslaved woman could produce a child every 2 years. Each child, at 15, would be worth between $800 and $1,200, depending on health, skill, and market conditions. A woman purchased at 20 and kept healthy could generate 6 to 8 children over her childbearing years. The return on investment exceeded tobacco by orders of magnitude. Driscoll began pairing people deliberately. He kept meticulous records, bloodlines, birth weights, childhood illnesses, temperaments. He separated families when it suited his breeding strategy, selling off men whose genetic contribution he no longer needed, keeping women and children on the property. He built a nursery staffed by older enslaved women whose job was to maximize child survival rates. He consulted agricultural journals about livestock breeding and applied similar principles to human reproduction. By 1852, the Driscoll plantation had tripled its enslaved population. Driscoll's net worth had increased from negative $9,000 to positive $43,000. He was written about in agricultural societies as an innovator, someone who had found a solution to the problem of declining soil fertility by shifting to a different commodity. The enslaved people on Driscoll's property understood exactly what was happening. They understood that they were being treated as livestock, that children were being conceived and raised for sale, that family bonds meant nothing compared to profit calculations. Some complied because they had no choice. Others resisted in small ways, inducing miscarriages with pennyroyal tea, sabotaging equipment, feigning illness to reduce productivity. But in March 1853, something shifted. A woman named Celia, who had been purchased as part of Driscoll's breeding stock and forced to bear 3 children, killed Driscoll's overseer, Micah Warren. She crushed his skull with a piece of firewood while he was asleep in his cabin. Then she burned his body in the fireplace, reducing him to ash and bone fragments that she scattered in the creek. Warren had been raping Celia for 2 years. Everyone on the plantation knew. Driscoll knew. Warren's wife knew. The other white employees knew. Celia had tried asking Driscoll to stop Warren, and Driscoll had told her to handle it herself or be sold, so she handled it. Celia was arrested, tried, and convicted of murder. Her defense argued that she had the right to protect herself from sexual assault, that even an enslaved woman possessed bodily autonomy under natural law. The jury deliberated for 2 hours and found her guilty. She was hanged on December 21st, 1853. She was 19 years old. The Driscoll plantation continued operating until 1861, when Edmund Driscoll joined the Confederate Army and was killed at Shiloh. His estate was eventually liquidated, the enslaved population scattered across multiple sales. But the records he kept, now housed in university archives, document in clinical detail how enslaved people were reduced to breeding stock, how their children were inventory, how the system operated not through individual cruelty, but structural incentives. And they document that some people refused to submit even when submission was the only path to survival. The Hargrove plantation in South Carolina sat 3 miles from the nearest town, connected by a road that turned to mud every winter. In 1846, people in town began noticing that they hadn't seen anyone from the Hargrove property in months. No one coming to market, no one at church, no correspondence with the lawyer who handled the family's affairs. In March 1847, the sheriff finally rode out to investigate. He found the plantation deserted. The main house was locked but intact. Outbuildings stood empty. The fields were overgrown. And in the family cemetery, 5 fresh graves with markers reading only Hargrove, 1846. It took 3 days of searching to piece together what happened. The enslaved population had systematically killed the Hargrove family. Father, mother, 2 adult sons, 1 daughter, over the course of 6 months. Each death had been made to look like natural illness. The family doctor, who visited twice during that period, noted fever, digestive distress, and general decline consistent with any number of diseases common in the Low Country. He prescribed rest, bland food, and laudanum. Then he left. After the last family member died in November 1846, the enslaved population had buried them properly, locked the house, and disappeared. All 23 people vanished. No trail, no witnesses, no evidence of where they went. The question that haunted investigators and later historians was how this happened without anyone noticing. The Hargroves had neighbors. They had business partners. They had a church community. For 6 months, that family died piece by piece, and no one intervened, no one investigated, no one asked questions until it was far too late. The answer was complicity through indifference. The Hargroves were not well liked. They were known as harsh owners who worked people to exhaustion and sold off children to settle gambling debts. Neighbors heard the screams from whippings and decided it was none of their business. The minister heard confessions from enslaved people about atrocities and chose to maintain confidentiality. The doctor saw symptoms that could have been poison and accepted the simpler explanation because investigating would have been inconvenient. What would you do if you suspected your neighbors were being murdered by the people they enslaved? Would you intervene? Or would you decide that people who treated human beings as property had perhaps earned whatever befell them? The Hargrove case was never solved. No one was ever charged. The property was eventually sold at auction, the proceeds distributed to distant relatives. And the 23 people who disappeared were never found, never traced, never accounted for in any official record. They had pulled off a near-perfect crime. And they had done it because the community around them chose not to see. In 1856, Edward Gaines purchased a plantation in Alabama specifically to implement his theories about labor efficiency. Gaines, who had studied engineering in England, believed that enslaved people could be made more productive through scientific management. He built a model plantation with barracks-style housing, a centralized dining facility, and a punishment structure based on mathematical calculation. Each offense had a point value. Missing work, 10 points. Talking back, 20 points. Attempting escape, 100 points. Points accumulated over weeks and were converted to punishments on Saturday evenings. 20 points meant an hour in stocks. 50 points meant a whipping. 100 points meant sale. Gaines tracked productivity with ledgers that noted each person's output per hour. He created incentive structures. Those who exceeded quotas received extra rations or small luxuries. Those who fell short had rations reduced. He believed he was creating a rational system that minimized violence by making consequences predictable. What he created was a machine of psychological torture. People knew exactly how much they had to produce to avoid punishment. which meant they pushed themselves past the point of injury. They knew that any error, any moment of exhaustion, any human limitation would be quantified and penalized. The predictability didn't reduce violence. It made every moment violent because the threat was constant and calculated. On July 4th, 1859, while Gaines was in Mobile purchasing new equipment, the enslaved population of his plantation enacted their own calculation. They locked the overseer and his assistant in the cotton gin. Then they set it on fire. The two men died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached them, which was perhaps a mercy they didn't deserve. Then they systematically destroyed everything Gaines had built. They burned the barracks, the dining hall, the storage buildings. They broke his ledgers into pieces and scattered them across the fields. They killed the livestock and left the carcasses rotting. When they were finished, nothing remained that could be salvaged or rebuilt. 70 people disappeared from the Gaines plantation that night. The militia tracked them for 3 weeks. They caught and executed 17. The rest made it into Creek territory, or melted into other enslaved populations where their identities could be obscured. Gaines returned to find his investment destroyed. He filed insurance claims and tried to rebuild, but the reputation of his plantation had spread. No enslaved person would work there voluntarily, and even those purchased and forced onto the property found ways to sabotage or escape. Within 2 years, Gaines sold what remained and moved to Texas. His ledgers, partially recovered, are now in archives. They document not just his methods, but the reality of what happened when someone tried to turn slavery into an engineering problem. The system required more than calculation. It required breaking people's spirits. And when you pushed that process to its logical extreme, when you made every moment measurable and every failure punishable, you created conditions where people decided death and rebellion was preferable to life in that machine. The Gaines atrocity, as it became known, killed 3 people directly, but it destroyed a system that had been designed to be unbreakable. By 1860, the intellectual and legal foundations of slavery were under assault from multiple directions. Abolitionist literature circulated despite laws banning it. The Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision had tried to settle the question of whether black people could be citizens, but instead of ending debate, it intensified it. Enslaved people were reading newspapers, listening to political speeches, understanding that the edifice was cracking. Then came John Brown. His raid on Harper's Ferry in October 1859 was militarily insignificant. 18 men trying to seize a federal armory to arm a slave rebellion. The raid failed within 36 hours. Brown was captured, tried, and hanged. But Brown's raid and his conduct during trial made him a martyr in northern states and a terror in southern ones. He had stated clearly that slavery was a sin that could only be washed away with blood. He had acted on that belief with violence, and he had gone to the gallows proclaiming that he was right. For enslaved people watching these events, Brown's raid was a signal that white allies existed, that armed resistance was thinkable, that the system's defenders were afraid. The reaction of southern states, tightening laws, increasing patrols, executing people on suspicion alone, confirmed that fear. In the 18 months between Brown's execution and the outbreak of the Civil War, incidents of arson, poisoning, and violence increased across the South. Plantations burned. Overseers were found dead. Arsenals were broken into and weapons stolen. The system that had relied on overwhelming force to maintain order found itself stretched thin, unable to respond to threats that came from everywhere and nowhere. The mathematics of control had changed. 4 million enslaved people, 350,000 slaveholding families, an economy built on coerced labor. What happened when the coercion stopped working? What happened when people decided the price of compliance was higher than the price of resistance? The answer came in 10 instances that are documented in trial records, newspaper accounts, and oral histories passed through generations. 10 cases where the violence was so complete, so calculated, that it forced a reckoning with what slavery had always been. Not a benign institution or a necessary evil, but a system of mass brutality that inevitably produced mass retaliation. Each case was different in its details, but they shared a pattern: careful planning, total commitment, and a willingness to accept death as the price of striking back. Christmas 1861 was supposed to be a celebration at the Blackwood Plantation. The war was going well for the Confederacy. First Manassas had proven that Southern troops could fight. Europe seemed likely to recognize the new nation. Marcus Blackwood, who owned 1,100 acres and 47 enslaved people, had sent his 2 eldest sons to fight. But the younger children were home, along with his wife Rachel, his mother Constance, and 3 cousins visiting from Natchez. On Christmas Eve, the household gathered for dinner. Traditional low-country fare: roasted pig, rice, collard greens, sweet potato pie. The meal was prepared by the kitchen staff and served by house servants who had been with the family for years. Everyone ate. Everyone praised the food. Everyone retired to their rooms around 10 in the evening. By midnight, everyone was dead. The investigation, conducted by Confederate authorities, already stretched thin by the war, pieced together the method over several weeks. The kitchen staff had laced everything with arsenic and jimsonweed. Not enough in any single dish to be detected by taste, but cumulatively enough to induce cardiac arrest within hours. The enslaved population had watched the family consume poison, had cleaned the dishes afterward, had waited until the death seizures finished. Then they had hidden the bodies. Some in the cotton gin, wrapped in burlap and stacked like bales. Some in the smokehouse rafters, where they could be mistaken for cured meat in dim light. Some weighted with chains and dropped into the river from the plantation dock. After that, they had locked the house, taken what supplies they could carry, and vanished into the night. 47 people moving through Mississippi during wartime, when Confederate patrols were watching for Union spies and escaped slaves. Most of them made it to freedom. Union lines were only 50 miles away. Federal records show that 23 people from the Blackwood Plantation reached Vicksburg in January 1862 and were documented as contraband of war. They told their story to Union officers, who wrote it down in reports that were filed and forgotten until historians began excavating them decades later. The Blackwood family's extended relatives discovered the bodies in early January. By then, decomposition and the creative disposal had made identification difficult. Some remains were never found. The plantation was liquidated, the property sold. The story circulated through Confederate territories as a horror story about what happened when vigilance slipped, when the enslaved population sensed weakness. But in Union territories, it circulated as something else. Evidence that enslaved people would and could organize, execute complex plans, and escape to freedom. Evidence that they were not passive victims waiting to be rescued, but active participants in their own liberation. The Blackwood Massacre killed 11 people. It freed 47. The arithmetic seemed clear. In March 1862, James Pendleton was one of the wealthiest men in Georgia. His plantation produced cotton, corn, and lumber. He owned 86 enslaved people. He served in the state legislature and had helped write Georgia's secession ordinance. He believed deeply that slavery was a divinely ordained institution and that the Confederacy was fighting for civilization itself. On March 7, 1862, his plantation burned. The fire started in the gin house around midnight and spread to the barns, the overseer's cottage, the stables, and eventually the main house. By dawn, everything was ash except the stone chimneys rising like tombstones from the ruins. James Pendleton's body was found in his study. He had been shot once in the head. His wife Elizabeth had been shot in her bed. Their 3 children, ages 6, 9, and 13, were found together in an upstairs room, killed with a single shot each. The overseer and his family were burned alive in their cottage, the door barred from outside. The entire enslaved population had disappeared. 86 people gone. Confederate authorities tracked them for 50 miles before losing the trail in swampland. Some were eventually recaptured. 5 were hanged after summary trials. But the majority, at least 60, escaped. What made the Pendleton burning significant wasn't just the scale, but the planning. Evidence suggested the escape had been coordinated with Union forces. Scouts had mapped routes. Supplies had been cached. The timing coincided with federal movements in the region that drew Confederate patrols away from the most direct routes to Union lines. Someone on the Pendleton plantation had been in communication with federal forces. Someone had been planning this for months. And when the moment came, they executed with military precision, neutralize the threats, destroy the infrastructure, disperse in multiple directions to complicate pursuit, regroup at designated points. James Pendleton had believed his enslaved population was loyal. He had convinced himself that the house servants who cooked his food, tended his children, and heard his conversations were content. The burning of his plantation demonstrated how completely he had misunderstood his own situation. The Confederate press tried to frame the Pendleton burning as Union atrocity, raiders disguising themselves, killing civilians, destroying property. But the evidence didn't support that narrative. No Union soldiers had been in the area. The killing had been precise, targeted at the family and those who enforced their power. The enslaved population's escape suggested intimate knowledge of local terrain. It was, unmistakably, an act of self-liberation through violence. And it terrified Confederate leadership because it suggested that enslaved people were capable of military-level organization, that they were monitoring the war's progress and seizing opportunities, that they would kill to be free. In his study, investigators found Pendleton's correspondence, letters to other legislators about how to prevent slave insurrection, plans for increased patrols and harsher penalties, arguments that the Confederacy needed to prioritize internal security. He had been strategizing about how to contain the very population that, while he was writing, was planning to kill him. The irony was not lost on anyone who examined the case. Between 1863 and 1865, as Union armies advanced through Confederate territory, dozens of plantations experienced what were recorded as domestic incidents: fires, poisonings, disappearances. The pattern was consistent enough that Confederate officials began tracking it, creating lists of properties affected and attempting to identify common factors. They found none. The incidents crossed state lines, targeted wealthy and middling plantations alike, hit families with reputations for cruelty and those considered relatively lenient. There was no obvious network, no coordinating body, no intercepted communications. But there was a network. It operated through layers of insulation, through coded language, through verbal communication that left no paper trail. Preachers traveling between plantations carried messages. Hired-out workers brought information from one property to another. Free black communities served as information hubs, gathering and distributing news, and embedded in those networks were what some historians call underground verdicts, collective decisions by enslaved communities about which owners and overseers would die and when. These weren't spontaneous. They were debated, planned, and executed with full knowledge that failure meant collective punishment. In June 1863, an overseer named Thomas Whitfield in Louisiana was found hanged from a tree on the property he managed. The enslaved population claimed he had taken his own life, overcome with guilt about his brutality. Confederate investigators suspected murder but couldn't prove it. The enslaved community protected each other with unified testimony, and without physical evidence beyond the body itself, the case went nowhere. 3 months later, a plantation owner in Mississippi named Robert Dane died from what was officially recorded as apoplexy, a sudden stroke. His personal physician noted symptoms consistent with poisoning but had no proof. The household insisted he had been in failing health. The case was closed. In January 1864, a planter's wife in Alabama named Catherine Merrill disappeared. She was last seen walking to the quarters to inspect conditions. Searchers found her shawl near a creek. Her body was never recovered. The enslaved population claimed she must have slipped, fallen, drowned. Without a corpse, there was no autopsy, no murder charge, no trial. Each case, examined alone, could be explained as accident, natural death, or genuine suicide. But examined together, they formed a pattern. People who had been notably cruel, who had raped, tortured, sold children to settle debts, worked people literally to death, were dying at rates that exceeded statistical expectation. The underground verdicts represented a form of justice operating outside any legal system. The enslaved communities were judging, convicting, and executing sentences without trials, without juries, without judges. They were taking the power that had always been used against them, the power to kill with impunity, and turning it back on their oppressors. Confederate authorities understood this was happening, but couldn't stop it. They were fighting a war against the Union. They didn't have resources to investigate every suspicious death on every plantation. And even when they did investigate, the solidarity of enslaved communities made evidence impossible to gather. No one testified. No one broke ranks. The network protected itself through silence. By 1865, the system of slavery wasn't just being dismantled by federal armies. It was being eroded from within by people who had decided they would no longer submit, would no longer wait for liberation, would take freedom by any means necessary. In April 1865, as Lee surrendered at Appomattox and Confederate resistance collapsed, a reckoning began across the South. Enslaved people who had waited years for this moment didn't wait for federal authorities to arrive. They walked off plantations. They claimed property. They confronted former owners. And in some cases, they enacted final retribution against those who had tormented them. The Walker Plantation in Georgia experienced what later investigators called a massacre. On April 10, 1865, 3 days after Lee's surrender, the enslaved population rose against the Walker family. 7 people died: Thomas Walker, his wife Anne, 2 adult sons, 1 daughter, and 2 overseers. The killings were not quick. Evidence suggested prolonged violence, bodies showing signs of torture that mirrored punishments the Walkers had inflicted over decades. The 43 people who had been enslaved on the Walker property didn't flee. They stayed. When federal troops arrived 2 weeks later, they found the survivors living in the main house, farming the land, operating as if they now owned the property, which in their view, they did. They had worked it for generations without compensation. They had bled into the soil. They believed it was theirs by right of their labor and suffering. The federal commander who took their testimony, Captain William Bradford, recorded their statements with a mixture of sympathy and legal confusion. Slavery was ending, but property rights remained murky. Were the formerly enslaved people squatters on someone else's land, or legitimate claimants to compensation for decades of unpaid labor? Were the killings murder, or justifiable self-defense delayed until they had the power to act? Bradford chose not to arrest anyone. He documented the deaths, noted them in his report, and moved on. The Walker property eventually fell into legal disputes that lasted years. The formerly enslaved population was eventually evicted, but not before they had lived as free people on land they had worked their entire lives. Similar scenes played out across the South in the war's final months and immediate aftermath. A plantation in South Carolina, a timber operation in Arkansas, a rice farm in North Carolina. In each case, formerly enslaved people took violent action against former owners or overseers, settling accounts that dated back years or decades. The number of such incidents is difficult to establish. Many went unrecorded. Federal authorities were overwhelmed with larger concerns: demobilization, reconstruction, dealing with refugee crises. Local white communities were traumatized, defeated, and in some cases destroyed. Record-keeping was sporadic, but oral histories preserved in black communities suggest the number was substantial. Dozens of killings, perhaps hundreds, in the chaotic period between Confederate collapse and the establishment of Reconstruction governments. These were not random acts of rage, but targeted violence against specific individuals who had earned specific hatreds. The formerly enslaved population was settling accounts. They were conducting their own trials, rendering their own verdicts, executing their own sentences, and they were doing it in the brief window when the old order had collapsed, but the new order hadn't yet imposed its own forms of control. It was justice of a kind. Rough, immediate, final, and for the people who enacted it, perhaps the only justice they would ever see. By 1866, the violence had largely stopped. Federal occupation brought a measure of order. Reconstruction governments, however flawed and temporary, established legal structures that offered alternatives to extrajudicial killing. Formerly enslaved people focused on building lives, finding family members sold away decades earlier, establishing communities, learning to navigate freedom. But the memory of the revenge killings remained. In white Southern communities, they became cautionary tales about Northern aggression, about the dangers of emancipation, about racial violence that required vigilant suppression. The actual details were often distorted or fabricated, the numbers inflated, the circumstances obscured. The killings became propaganda in the lost cause mythology that would shape Southern identity for generations. In black communities, the stories took different forms. Some became legends, stories of resistance and triumph, of people who fought back and lived to tell about it. Others were whispered warnings about the costs of violence, the ways retribution could spiral into chaos that hurt everyone. Still others were simply acknowledged facts, neither celebrated nor condemned, just part of the complicated history of how slavery ended and freedom began. Historians have struggled with how to interpret these events. Were the revenge killings justified? Can violence in response to systematic brutality be considered moral? Does the context of slavery create conditions where normal ethical frameworks don't apply? There are no clean answers. The people who poisoned their owners, burned plantations, killed families, they were responding to a system that had commodified them, raped them, worked them to death, sold their children. They were reclaiming humanity through the most extreme means available. But they also killed people, including children in some cases, and destroyed property that could have been repurposed for collective benefit. The moral complexity doesn't erase the historical fact. It happened. Enslaved people killed their enslavers. They did it strategically, methodically, and in significant enough numbers that it constituted a pattern. And they did it because the system left them no other path to justice. What's clear from the archival record is that these were not impulsive acts. The journals, letters, and testimony that survive reveal long-term planning, collective decision-making, and clear understanding of consequences. People knew they might die. They knew they might bring collective punishment on their communities. They chose to act anyway because submission had become unbearable. Today, if you know where to look, you can find traces of these histories embedded in the landscape. Plantation foundations overgrown with kudzu, family cemeteries with graves that stop abruptly in the 1860s, local legends about haunted properties where entire families died mysteriously, archives holding trial records, newspaper accounts, federal reports that document killings attributed to unknown assailants or domestic insurrection. The Blackwood Plantation site is now a nature preserve. A historical marker mentions that it was abandoned during the Civil War, but gives no details about why. The Pendleton property was eventually subdivided and sold. Parts of it are now suburban housing developments, where residents likely have no idea what happened on that land in March 1862. Some families descended from enslaved people at these plantations still carry oral histories. Stories passed through generations about ancestors who fought back, who escaped, who survived when survival seemed impossible. These histories are treasured, protected, shared carefully with those who can be trusted to understand their weight. And some descendants of slaveholding families carry different knowledge. Family stories about plantations that burned, relatives who disappeared, properties that were lost in violent circumstances. These stories are often less discussed, buried under shame or rationalized as tragedies inflicted by others rather than consequences of the family's own actions. The violence that ended slavery, both the organized military campaigns and the individual acts of retribution, remains contested territory in American memory. We build monuments to generals but struggle to acknowledge the enslaved people who killed to be free. We teach about armies and battles, but rarely about the parallel war of resistance that happened in kitchens, fields, and quarters. The 10 cases documented here represent a fraction of what happened. For every recorded instance, how many went unrecorded? How many deaths were ruled accidental or natural when they were actually murder? How many escapes were facilitated by violence that left no survivors to report it? We'll never have complete numbers. The archive is too fragmentary, too shaped by those who had power to create and preserve records. But the evidence that exists is sufficient to establish that revenge killings were not anomalies, but a consistent pattern, a form of resistance that enslaved people employed when other options had been exhausted or had never existed. The German Coast Rebellion's heads on pikes rotted away. Nat Turner's bones were scattered. Marguerite's ledger disappeared into private collections. The Blackwood Plantation returned to forest. But the memory persists in communities that still exist, that still gather, that still tell stories about the time when people who had been denied every other form of power seized the most fundamental power of all: the power to say no, to refuse, to strike back even at the cost of their own lives. In Burke County, Georgia, old families still whisper about properties that fell during the war. In Vicksburg, local historians document plantation sites that were mysteriously abandoned. In archives across the South, researchers keep finding fragments: a trial record, a newspaper clipping, a letter, that add pieces to a story we're still learning to tell. These 10 cases are part of American history that doesn't fit comfortable narratives about the Civil War, about emancipation, about how slavery ended. They force us to confront the reality that freedom wasn't given. It was taken, seized, purchased with blood by people who had every moral right to demand it and no legal avenue to claim it. The violence was real. The dead can't be resurrected. The plantations that burned stayed burned. And the people who fought back, who killed, who escaped, they lived with what they had done, carrying that weight into freedom. Some nights in the Low Country, people say you can still smell smoke from fires that burned over a century and a half ago. Still hear echoes of struggles that official history tried to forget. Whether that's true or just folklore, the fact remains: the ground remembers what we choose to forget. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.